Marcus Coleman stood in the doorway of his barn, watching the late afternoon sun paint the Montana sky in shades of amber and rose. At 58 years old, he'd grown accustomed to the silence of his ranch. The only sounds were the soft nickering of horses and the distant rustle of wind through the cottonwood trees. He was a tall man with a strong, weathered face that spoke of years spent under the open sky. His dark skin had been burnished by countless days in the sun, and though his beard showed touches of gray, his eyes remained clear and thoughtful. Today, he wore his work clothes, a denim shirt, faded jeans, and the white cowboy hat that had become as much a part of him as his own shadow. Marcus had inherited this ranch from his father 20 years ago, after his wife Sarah passed away from cancer. They'd never had children, and after she was gone, he'd found comfort in solitude. The horses needed him, the land needed him, and that had been enough. Or so he'd told himself through all those quiet years. It was a Tuesday afternoon when he heard the unfamiliar sound of tires on his gravel drive. Marcus rarely had visitors. He set down the bridle he'd been mending and walked toward the front of the property, curiosity overriding his preference for privacy. A silver sedan pulled to a stop near the main house. The driver's door opened, and a woman stepped out. She was perhaps in her early 40s, with blonde hair that caught the sunlight and fell in soft waves past her shoulders. She wore an elegant champagne-colored dress that seemed oddly formal for a ranch visit, and she moved with a careful grace, as though unsure of her footing on the uneven ground. Marcus approached slowly, his hat shading his eyes. "Can I help you, ma'am?" The woman looked up at him, and something flickered in her expression. Recognition, perhaps, or hope. "Marcus Coleman?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. "That's right." He stopped a respectful distance away, waiting. She smiled then, a genuine expression that reached her blue eyes. "I'm not sure if you remember me. I'm Claire Henderson." "Well, Claire Bennett now. We were school friends, back at Roosevelt Elementary." Marcus felt something shift in his memory. Roosevelt Elementary. That was nearly 50 years ago. He studied her face more closely, searching for the girl he might have known in that distant past. And then it came to him, a small blonde girl with braids, always sitting in the front row, always raising her hand to answer questions. "Claire Bennett," he said slowly. "You sat next to Tommy Richardson in 3rd grade. You let me borrow your eraser when mine wore down to nothing." Her smile widened, and he saw the hint of tears in her eyes. "You do remember. Come inside," Marcus said, gesturing toward the house. "I'll make us some coffee." They sat in his modest kitchen, the afternoon light streaming through the window above the sink. Marcus prepared the coffee with practiced movements, finding comfort in the familiar ritual while his mind spun with questions. "It's been a long time," Claire said, wrapping her hands around the warm mug he offered her. "I hope you don't mind me just showing up like this." "I don't mind," Marcus replied, settling into the chair across from her. "Though I'll admit to being curious about what brings you all the way out here." Claire took a sip of her coffee, gathering her thoughts. "I moved back to Montana 6 months ago. My husband passed away a year and a half ago, and I've been trying to figure out what comes next. I remembered that you had a ranch out this way. It took some asking around, but I found you." "I'm sorry for your loss," Marcus said quietly. He knew that particular pain all too well. "Thank you." Claire's fingers traced the rim of her mug. "The truth is, I've been feeling quite lost. My children are grown and living their own lives. I sold our house in Seattle, and I came back here because this is where I grew up. Where I have roots, even if most of them have grown over." Marcus nodded, understanding more than she might have expected. "It's hard, starting over." "It is," she agreed. "I've been renting a small place in town, trying to decide what to do with myself. And then I remembered you. I remembered how kind you always were at school. How you helped smaller kids with their lunch trays, how you never joined in when others were being mean." She paused, meeting his eyes. "I thought maybe we could be friends again. If you're open to that." Marcus considered this. He'd grown so used to solitude that the idea of friendship felt both foreign and strangely appealing. "I think I'd like that," he said finally. Over the following weeks, Claire became a regular visitor to the ranch. She would arrive in the late afternoons, sometimes bringing fresh bread from the bakery in town, other times just bringing herself and her gentle company. Marcus found himself looking forward to her visits. She had a way of talking that was both soothing and engaging. She told him about her life in Seattle, about raising 2 daughters and working as a librarian. She spoke of her husband David with fondness but without the crushing grief that Marcus remembered from his own early days of loss. You learn to carry it differently, she explained one evening as they sat on his porch, watching the sun set. The sadness doesn't go away, but it becomes part of you rather than the whole of you. Marcus nodded. Sarah used to say something similar, near the end. She told me that she'd always be with me, just in a different way. She sounds like she was a wise woman. She was, Marcus agreed. She made me promise not to lock myself away forever. I'm not sure I've kept that promise very well. Claire reached over and patted his hand, a simple gesture of understanding. You're talking to me, aren't you? That's a start. As autumn turned toward winter, their friendship deepened. Claire began helping Marcus with small tasks around the ranch. She wasn't experienced with horses, but she was a quick learner and genuinely interested. He taught her how to brush the horses properly, how to check their hooves for stones, how to read their moods and temperaments. One particularly cold November afternoon, Claire arrived looking troubled. Marcus was in the barn, tending to his favorite mare, a gentle chestnut named Willow. The horse stood patiently as he ran the brush along her flank, her dark eyes peaceful. Marcus, Claire's voice carried a note of uncertainty. He looked up from his work. What's wrong? She stepped into the barn, hugging herself against the chill. I've been offered a position. Head librarian at the county library system. It's a good job, exactly what I was hoping for. That's wonderful news, Marcus said, though something in her tone made him pause. Isn't it? It is, she agreed. But it means I'll be busier. I won't be able to visit as often. She met his eyes. I've come to treasure these afternoons with you, Marcus. I don't want to lose that. Marcus set down the brush and walked over to where she stood. You won't lose it. We'll just have to be more intentional about making time. That's what friends do. Relief washed over her features. You're right, thank you. But as winter settled in properly, Marcus found the truth of his words tested. Claire's new position did keep her busy, and her visits became less frequent. The ranch felt emptier somehow, the silence more pronounced. He realized, with some surprise, that he'd grown accustomed to having her around, to sharing his space and his thoughts. With another person. It was during one of the coldest weeks in January when things changed again. Marcus was working in the barn when he heard a car pull up, followed by an odd thumping sound. He went outside to find Claire struggling to unload something large from her trunk. What in the world? He asked, hurrying over. Help me with this, would you? She said, a bit breathless. Together they pulled out a large box containing a space heater. Your barn is freezing, Claire explained. I worry about you spending so much time out here in this cold. Marcus felt something warm unfold in his chest. You didn't have to do that. I know, she said simply. But I wanted to. They set up the heater in the barn, and Claire produced a thermos of hot cocoa from her car. They sat on hay bales, warming their hands on the cups, watching the horses shift peacefully in their stalls. I've been thinking, Claire said after a while, about what you said, about being intentional with our time. What if you came to my place for dinner? I could cook for both of us, and it would save you from all those frozen meals I know you eat. Marcus chuckled. Are my eating habits that transparent? You're a bachelor living alone on a ranch, she said with a smile. It's not hard to deduce. So began a new pattern. Once a week, Marcus would clean up, put on his good shirt, and drive into town for dinner at Claire's small rental house. She was an excellent cook, and the meals she prepared reminded him of the family dinners he'd enjoyed in his childhood, foods rich with care and attention. But more than the food, he treasured the conversations. They talked about everything. Childhood memories, books they'd read, worries about the world, hopes for what came next. Claire told him about her daughters, and he could hear the pride in her voice even when she spoke of their struggles. Marcus shared stories about Sarah, and found that speaking of her brought more comfort than pain now. One evening in early spring, as they finished a meal of pot roast and vegetables, Claire grew quiet. Marcus had learned to recognize this mood in her, the thoughtful silence that preceded something important. What is it? He asked gently. She looked up at him, her expression serious. My lease is up at the end of next month. The landlord wants to sell the property, and I need to find somewhere else to live. Marcus felt a jolt of concern. Have you started looking? I have, she said. But everything available is either too expensive or in poor condition. I've been trying to figure out what to do. She paused, then continued in a rush. I know this is probably forward of me, but your ranch is so large. I wondered if you might consider renting me one of the outbuildings. I could convert it into a small living space. I wouldn't intrude on your privacy, but I'd be nearby if you needed help with anything. Marcus sat back in his chair, considering. The idea should have alarmed him. He'd protected his solitude for so long. But instead, he felt something like relief. The thought of Claire living on the property, of having her nearby, felt right in a way he couldn't quite articulate. I have a better idea, he said slowly. The main house has 3 bedrooms. I only use one. Why don't you move into the house? You could have your own space, your own room, and we could share the common areas. No rent, he added, as she started to protest. Just friendship and company. Claire stared at him. Marcus, that's incredibly generous, but people will talk. Let them, he said with a shrug. We're both old enough to know our own minds. We're friends. That's all that matters. She smiled then, a slow, grateful smile. Are you sure? I'm sure, he said, and he was. The move happened on a bright Saturday in May. Claire didn't have much, just her personal belongings and books, so many books. Marcus helped her carry boxes into the guest room, which had the best morning light. She set up her things with care, and by evening, the house felt different. Fuller. Lived in. They established routines naturally. Claire would make breakfast while Marcus tended to the early morning chores. They'd have coffee together, discussing the day ahead. In the evenings, they often sat on the porch, reading or simply watching the land settle into twilight. The neighbors did talk, as Claire had predicted. But Marcus found he didn't care. For the first time in 20 years, he didn't feel alone in his own home. And it wasn't romance, not in the traditional sense. It was something deeper and more sustainable, true companionship. One evening in late summer, as they sat watching fireflies dance across the pasture, Claire spoke softly. Thank you, Marcus, for taking a chance on an old school friend who showed up out of nowhere. Marcus smiled. Thank you for remembering that I existed. For caring enough to find me. She reached over and took his hand, a gesture that had become comfortable between them. We were always meant to be friends, I think. It just took us 50 years to figure it out. He squeezed her hand gently. Better late than never. As the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, Marcus reflected on the unexpected path his life had taken. He'd thought his story was finished, that he'd live out his remaining years in quiet isolation. But Claire had shown him that there were still chapters to be written, still connections to be made. The ranch was no longer silent. It was filled with the sounds of friendship, laughter over shared meals, conversations that stretched into the night, the simple comfort of knowing someone cared whether you came home safely. Marcus had lived alone for years, protecting his grief like a precious thing. But Claire had gently shown him that healing didn't mean forgetting, and that opening your heart again didn't diminish what came before. It simply made room for more. As they sat together in the gathering darkness, 2 old friends who had found each other again, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in a very long time, contentment. Not the contentment of settling, but the deep satisfaction of knowing he was exactly where he was meant to be, with exactly the right person beside him. The journey had been long and sometimes lonely, but it had led him here, to this moment, to this friendship that asked nothing more than presence and kindness. And that, Marcus thought, was more than enough. It was, in fact, everything.